is 2 o'clock, and so I am going to go ahead and get started here. Thank you to our panelists and to everyone who has come in today to hear from our panelists today. This is the fourth panel series, the fourth panel in the series, Race in the 21st Century. In this panel discussion, we have Dr. Terri Witek, I apologize, Professor of English and Sullivan Chair in Creative Writing at Stetson University. And she is joined by Masters of Fine Arts, Stetson Masters of Fine Arts students and Sullivan scholars, Mal Trimarchi and Kyo-Nicole Padgett. And so the title of this particular panel is called In Which Eye? And I am very intrigued to sort of hear about how each of these panelists, and I think everyone will really learn a lot, use their written and visual artistic skills to think about and explore the concepts of race and identity. And so without me talking too much more, I want to go ahead and give the panel an opportunity to introduce themselves, as well as Dr. Harry Price, who is also on this call, or this, I'm sorry, on this panel.
Hello, everyone. Looking forward to another really great conversation this afternoon. These are wonderful.
Hi, so my name is Kyo-Nicole Padgett. As Ms. Jackson said, I am one of the MFA students with Stetson's MFA of the Americas in Poetry in the Expanded Field. Are we jumping in, or do you want Mal to introduce herself as well? Okay. So I'm also 25% Japanese, which has always been this great prompter for comments, as anyone who grew up with parents not from here know. And those comments are everything from, huh, I don't see it, to, are you sure you're Japanese? Are you enough Japanese? To my favorite, which happened when I was very young, visiting my aunts up in New York, and they go, wow, you look more Japanese than your mother. My mother, who is double my blood, who is from Tachikawa, right outside Tokyo, whose great-grandfather was samurai to the emperor, whose mother was disowned for marrying an American man, and I look more Japanese, which is an ego boost, which shouldn't be, but it is. So it's always been this really interesting question of, am I Japanese enough? Do I get to talk about these things? Do I, I certainly get to stand in the room of Asian American authors and writers and artists, but do I get a seat at the table? And that's always kind of plagued the work. That's always been a big part of it. And not always just for me. Very, very often for the people editing my work, it was, you need to talk about it. You have a duty to talk about it. And then the same tables going, you're not enough to talk about this. Why are you trying to talk about this? Just stick to Florida. Just stick to what you look like. So it's always this really interesting bit of, how do I go about it? And in thinking about that, first with art, I have a background in graphic arts, visual arts, and then poetry came about really in high school, and then it kind of came about in college because Terri Witek got her claws into me, and I've been better ever since. But this question has always been there. How do I talk about it? And it took me a very, very long time to realize I don't need to, not because I don't need to talk about it, but because I don't need to consider the other person reading it. it's not whether I talk about it or not, because doing that separates the white from the Japanese. They become separate things rather than just being who I am, what I grew up with. I grew up with my mother's stories of clearings in Tokyo. I grew up with her telling me about the ghosts on the poles, going to give her elderly neighbor food and not wanting to walk by the haunted well every weekend. And all of these things. I grew up with ozoni at midnight on New Year's Eve, throwing out all the trash to get rid of the good luck. These very, very Japanese things that cross over, of course, as any other culture does. And it didn't make sense anymore to think of them as separate things. So I looked into Japanese poetry. And when you look up Japanese poetry, especially with an American-centric Google, you get haiku. It's the main thing you get. It's the first thing you get. And traditional haiku was this bit before a renga. It didn't used to be its own thing, which I think is very apt in general, but it became its own standalone poem that had a couple very specific elements. And of course, there's modern stuff. There's stuff that's in different languages, and it's still called a haiku now, which is very interesting. But traditional haiku has 17 on, which are the little syllables. If you think of any of the kanji, any of the hiragana or katakana, those are on. They're individual little characters. So it's not the syllables like we're taught. It's not the 575, but it can be. There's a whole American tradition of it now. It's new. That's a whole different debate. But it was something that I went, well, then I can't write it. I don't know Japanese. I'm doing the same thing. Am I appropriating it? I can't write it. And I looked further because there's more than that to a haiku. There's a kireji, which is a cutting word. And it's something we have in English and really any kind of poetry you want. A cutting word is that thing that shifts the poem. It's a shift in the poem or a final image at the very, very end, similar to a vulture in a sonnet. It's just, it leaves you with something else. And then there's a hoji, which is the reference to a season or a reference to a time. Very, very often not actually saying the time. Most of the time it's just a poppy blooms. And you know when. A cicada chirps, it's summer. The boys' festival, he eats a dumpling. You know right when it is. So it's all of these interesting things, and they always come down to, or most often come down to, a visual. And I realized in what I was doing, in the way I had grown up and what my mother had taught me and read to me, I was already doing these things in my poetry. I was already focusing everything on an image. I was already referencing the seasons. I was already shifting somewhere in the work to bring in something else. And I thought about it as, let's write them that way. Let's sit down, think of them in this kind of formula, think of it in this kind of structure, and see what we get. So I have two poems to read to you guys today. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it shares very nicely. We'll do Florida Cottonmouth first. Florida Cottonmouth. Under the monstrous cypress, I thought you were root half hidden in swamp water. I only wanted the bowfin stuck beside you, intertwining twigs, collapsing the mirror lights to attempt escape. I did nothing when you latched onto the soft spot of my palm, fangs deep, throwing silt into golden hour. My mother was snake sign too. Maybe you somehow knew her. Maybe she ate your mother on a dare in Tokyo. Twisting midair, the moon swelled low and wood rot absorbed the timbre of my scream. I pulled you too hard. We, an odd momentary Ouroboros in Florida light. Dead and venom drained you fell. The fish remained. So in this one, we have that very clear image of the snake biting the palm, being pulled apart. We have the seasonal time reference in the light, in when the bowfin comes out and the snake come out at the same time. Force your reader to do a little bit of work if you don't already. We have the shift talking back about my mother, and we have something that I didn't realize I did until I pulled these poems for this talk, which was including my mother's stories, which I do even if I don't have text in the work. They're always there, they're always informing it, and there's always something to be said about it just lingering and just being on the fringe. I'll show you the last one, and that is Trade-Off. Oh, did I hit the wrong one? Trade-Off. I've been waking with acid on my throat lately. Gradually, over the week, a small burn creeping higher without notice, until, of course, it's almost in my mouth leaking out. I had to stop keeping water by the bed when the heat got worse. The palmetto bugs, driven inside as they are every year, claimed glass after glass, and for the best, I suppose. I remember the wasabi incident, but the lactose intolerant deters any real help, so I've taken to a mouthful of rice. Each morning, late morning, when the light is already invasive, I've dragged my acid throat out of a heat-soaked summer bed to the kitchen where I cooked the previous night, almost not enough to bother rice, and shovel a small mouthful of short grains on the problem. They work, quickly sticking as she always said, and I look over my shoulder, wondering if it's the cat come to beg, or the Tingu come to take my eyes for not eating every bite. And I think that's it for me. So we'll switch over to the phenomenal Terri Witek. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to tell you about something that happened to me in March. Terri Witek. So when the pandemic caught hold, I came home on a really scary flight from LA, or red eye. The image of that most sticks with me from that return flight is the attendant offering water. Her white ungloved fingers crouched over the clear plastic lip cup in the thrumming dark. I shouldn't drink this, I thought. Then I took it and drank. As one did in the first lost days of the pandemic, I poked through my rooms. My find this time was a collection of mid-20th century pulp books stored for over a decade. The covers seemed filled with enormous hands. Why had I never noticed how many white hands there were on these things? I tried to read the insides, but I couldn't. I tried to make poems, but I couldn't. So I started to sew the white hands with white thread. Of course, it seems now that my action is partly about washing hands, our repeatable ritual, what we do all the time now, the white foam covering and uncovering. But it also seems to be about whiteness and contaminant power. That's what Ryan Rivas said is when he wrote to me about what he saw in the images. And of course, what I suspected was really piercing me as I pulled thread through crumbling paper. What is this country's most long-running pandemic? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar jabbed into my ear. Here was my own white hand piercing this paper and pulling these books I couldn't read, adding more whiteness. That I hurt the covers by sewing them was true. I definitely was scolded online. What were these objects' lives? What was I trying to do? Was I gloving them? What did it mean as a writer to mark over these marks? At some point, the books began to touch each other, and I started to sew them together. Now they often seem less about intimate seduction and more about larger countries, maybe even the future. Are these large right hands our galactic doom? Is it always death to write white? The last one I made, I didn't have to sew. These awful smooth-faced Aryan children drawn magnetically together with a scrum of planets between them. I want to end with something that came to me later. It was about white touch, I think, and it was also about the connection between eye and hand, something I think a lot about. So come with me to the huge Adrian Piper retrospective MoMA in 2018. Piper has a lot of interactive work. Giveaway cards are a classic. So there's a little box against a gallery wall. It's filled with square stacked paper. A sign says, "Take only one," as I remember it. So people would come up, they'd reach their hands out, they'd touch what the giveaway was. Why did they look down and back off? What did they drop? As if the things were nearly on fire. Well, let's walk over. Are we going to pick it up? Are we going to take it home? What are we going to do with it? It said it was for free, and of course, it's flag covered.
Thank you for that, Terri. Thank
And
you.
now, wonderful Mal Trimarchi.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mal, and I guess I'll start with sharing the image and talking about it as you view it. I will not ever get over it. So have a nice day. Have a nice day, a service industry phrase taken and put into a context where a Black person denies unwarranted demands from a white person in the form of apology and service. It says, "Go and leave me be, leave me to bleed and wash off your blood." The blood. When a Black person claps back at a white person's slight, the white person will bleed in response. Their apologeticness or their take of offense. They'll say, "My blood is on your hands, your blood is on your hands," with their actions and their words. With these paintings, I explore the intersection of race and femininity. When I first started creating these paintings, I wasn't really thinking about Blackness and femininity necessarily in my conscious mind, but on the subconscious, what's clear is the depiction of underappreciated bodies and Black bodies, sexuality, Blaxploitation, or the appropriating of typically white properties or ideas for the self, and with the phrasing, a response to the white expectation of service of a Black woman minding her own business in the supermarket. And what I think about is how I seek assistance from Black people and Black women while being Black versus how a white person might seek assistance. It's a feeling of safety versus an expectation of service, a microaggression. I sought out assistance while I was abroad, mostly directional, from Black women because I felt safe doing so in an unfamiliar place. Meanwhile, white people often seek out assistance from Black women in the form of service based on an assumption of power, position, Black specialization within service industry, those assumptions. So for the imagery, I dabbled in sexuality, and the imagery sort of like contradicts the typical idea of a succubus and the vampire. Typically perky breasts, small bodied or thin. With the first painting, the succubus has saggy breasts, and the second painting, the vampire is full bodied. And they aren't usually given these attributes. So the figures get, I see that the figures get blacker or more stereotypically Black with each installation. From an ambiguous black-coated demon to the second image, a sort of mammy figure that was inspired partly by Betty Saar. And for the third image, I thought about who should the third image be? Should it be me? Or am I Black enough? Also, the realism shift from 1 to 3 is also visible, with 1 being more cartoony, 2 being somewhat more realistic, and 3 will be based on a real photograph. And they're covered in the blood of themselves, as well as the blood of the white person that slighted them. And I think that's all I can say.
Excellent, Mal. I think you've said enough. Thank you for sharing those. Thank you all. You all have extraordinary insights, right, that we see manifesting in your written words, in your weavings, in your paintings. So really, it's a delight to have this opportunity to look at this work and to hear your voices. I have a series of questions. I do have some more directed towards each of you, but I also do want to take this moment to remind, if anyone has a question, please do go ahead and put that in the chat. And then Harry, if you see something that looks like you know that needs to be addressed, if you want to just do a hand, because I'm just going to kind of move through. So just kind of, I mean, I think I'm just gonna start with Mal and Kyo. I mean, just because we kind of left off on there, and you both had sort of this question of, am I Black enough? Am I Japanese enough? Right? That sort of, am I enough? And I think even Terri, in some of your work too, is this question about being enough, or I don't know. So I kind of want to explore, and maybe white, what is whiteness? What is blackness? What is, to be Japanese? I want to understand more how you guys are thinking about this idea of enough. So anyone can respond to that. Whoever wants to go first.
So for me, it's the idea of sort of having that seat at the table and being able to speak about it without someone forcing you to constantly justify why you're there. Very often, if I try and talk about being Japanese, the other person has some variation of, oh, I don't see it in your face, or, oh, well, here's my experience too. Not to say that I don't absolutely welcome the chance to hear about somebody else's experiences, but there's a level of authority that comes with it, and that kind of question of, do I get to be an authority on this in certain circumstances? So if I'm talking and a coworker comes up and it's a white coworker that says, oh yeah, people think I'm Asian too when I squint, which is something that's been said to me. Yeah, that's the face to make. When do you get to go, well, you're very wrong, let's talk about it?
Oh yeah, awful.
And when do you have to just kind of shut up because somebody could answer the question better?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to follow on that really quick before anyone else answers. When do you have to shut up?
Never.
Never.
No, I think there is a level of, I have to admit, there is 75% of me that is very white. I grew up here. I did not grow up in Japan. So somebody who has that experience, it's not my place to talk over them.
Okay.
And I think that's just something to always consider, who has something to say on it that you could not say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Kyo. Mal, I want to bounce over to you. Am I Black enough?
So I'm mixed, Black and white. My mom is technically mixed as well, and my grandma is mixed. And growing up and just living my life as an adult, I'm in the dark about whether or not a person will see me as Black, or see me as mixed, or see me as mostly white, and it can be someone asking me whether my mom or dad is Black, or it could be someone calling me white casually, or it could be someone dating me because I'm mixed and they're interested in dating someone who's got a little bit of Black in them, so they think. But just living my life like this, I don't know.
So Matt, how do you define it for you, right? So those are how other people kind of,
Right.
You have to bounce around and navigate and explain or not explain, or need you to fit some definition that makes sense for them to know how to negotiate with you. But how do you talk about it in your art, right? Clearly, your description of your art, it is very Black-centered. You talk about finding safety, right, in seeking out Black bodies, as opposed to seeking Black bodies for service, right? That was sort of the comparative that you had done. So I guess, I mean, do you have a similar sentiment like Kyo, where you are enough? Or is that something that is always kind of a negotiation?
I think it's still a question that exists in my mind. Am I enough?
Yeah.
Because I guess I haven't encountered enough people or seeked out enough opinions to really validate either way. But of course, my family validates me. I guess I just don't seek it out enough, the validation.
No, I mean, that makes sense. Thank you, Mal. And I think what's also interesting is it really highlights, and again, I'm a sociologist, and so sociology is really concerned with the environment, right? When we think about the nature versus nurture debate, which one is shaping who we are and our choices, you know, what you really sort of exemplify in that answer is how much our interactions with others really are super important in defining how we may come to see ourselves, right, and make sense of who we are. Kyo, it looks like you might have had something that you were coming back with, or?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say the same, that validating, and exactly what you were talking about. There was a point where I was in an elevator in Argentina, and this very nice Italian man and his wife recognized the Japanese in me, and I went back to my room and cried because it had never happened before. So there's, that validation is always something that's real, and the question is always real.
Yes, being seen, right? There's a question of being seen, right? And then I guess that gets to Terri's work, right? So Terri, I'm just going to weave you into this conversation because that's what you wanted to do, was make the unseen seen, to highlight these white hands. And suddenly suddenly whiteness was very present and real for you. If you want to share some thoughts about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very conscious of being white ever since high school, when Martin Luther King was killed during my high school time, and I was just on the verge of turning 17, and I remember when I was invited for this panel, being in the washroom with black girls that I went to school with who were wearing black armbands, and I was not sure whether I could wear one. And the timeline was so crucial because right after that, literally 2 months after that, I was an exchange student in Brazil where race is coded so differently, and I didn't speak the language at all. So for me, I felt very large and very white. I was also with people who considered themselves white. It was really amazing. It was very clear to me that I had to keep an eye open. And if I couldn't see it, I had to listen to it. And I wasn't sure what I could touch. I wasn't sure how it was signaling. But I think the reason you asked me once about the sewing, I think the sewing is kind of like, you know, pricking myself back into my body and my consciousness of this. Because sometimes writing is on a flat surface and it's just covering up white paper. And I just am more interested in now in the materiality of language and how it makes shapes and how it makes, and I really do go back to those black bands, which come to me now when I see masks on people in the street because of COVID. I think, you know, and the hoodie, I mean, what are we covering? What are we revealing? And what are we washing? What is it to wash? So I feel pricked all the time by my whiteness, and in a way that makes me feel quite helpless, frankly. Yeah, helpless.
And I think what's also interesting about that is, again, emphasizing that this is not within you, right? This is an external force or an external pressure. And I think for everyone on the panel, right, this responding to this thing called race, right, that organizes us and our lives, and that we do feel helpless to it in a variety of ways that manifest, and how it comes to define in some ways who we are, or at least force us to have to negotiate those relations. Yeah, very powerful words there, Terri. Thank you. I think, Harry, you had wanted to jump in there, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Thank you. So the chat room is coming alive, and there's some interesting discussion that you have sparked. Chaz, our colleague Chaz Underreiner, has a question that any of you can respond to, okay? And it says, as a cis white man, I feel pretty clueless as to how my ethnic heritage, my whiteness, inform my artistic work. This may be because I have the privilege of not needing to think about it to be accepted as an artist. Can any of you respond to this or to me?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to thinking about your own whiteness and how that comes across in a piece you're doing in any of your work, and you as a person, it's just a matter of, it's not to say to discount what's very, very personal to you, because that always matters. Race aside, that always matters. But also what perspective you're taking, who you're doing the work for, and who it benefits. I think the biggest question is who it benefits. And this is something that's not just a white question. This is something that's a question I ask in my work. Does what I do kind of fetishize being Japanese to an extent? Does it make me look cooler? Because there is that benefit of race where I can still be white, but I can still be this interesting thing. I look exotic. Never say that. But I think it's who you're doing the work for and what that person or whoever gets out of it.
Anyone else like to?
Well, I guess I should say something as a cisgendered white woman. I think that the thing is that race has made our country. I mean, racial strife is the pandemic that formed us. So I think we are racially formed, and racism for all of us. And I always quote Claudia Rankin in Citizen. I mean, she's just my guiding light on these things. And she says that really there is a really big wall around examining whiteness, despite all the whiteness studies that there have been. There's a real temptation to guard it. And all I can say is, what are we guarding? We're guarding toxicity, no guarding, That's all.
I think there might have been another hand up, but it went back down.
If you don't mind, Harry, I wouldn't mind just following on with Terry's comment, right? Because she kind of posed a question, although it was a rhetorical question. But I would say, I think for many people too, I mean, and I think that kind of came out in some of the earlier answers in talking about being Japanese enough or Black enough or whatever that is. I think what we're guarding are boundaries, right? Things we can claim as ours. And so that's a tension, right? A very real tension as to where I belong, who are my people, clan, tribe. These are very, very old ways of organizing ourselves, right? And they do represent a sense of safety and security in the ways that Mal talks about being abroad, right? In a foreign place, you look for your own. And I don't think for many of us, we have to travel outside of the country to experience isolation in our everyday lives, right? As we navigate through these social spaces, as we continue to encounter a world of approaching 8 billion people and counting, right? We can feel very lost in modernity, in sort of all of these new ways in which we're organized, that we're craving something that's familiar and old and ancient. But at the same time, right, it creates this kind of toxicity, because I think the thing that overshadows it is when we attach power and privilege, right, or subordination and domination, which we see expressed in particular in the paintings, right, that Mal talks about in the hands that you're stitching across the covers, you know, and the ways in which, you know, Kyo, your poems harken back to my mother, right? You bring up my mother, my stories are rooted in my mother, right? So there's that safety, we pull back into safety, but at the same time, right? So this, we also have to interact. And so it is a really interesting thing, and it is an interesting question. What is it that we're responding to, and then how can we do that in such ways that aren't necessarily as harmful, right, as we may be doing them today. So yes, I just wanted to jump on that. Harry, I will let you continue.
Yeah, you know, so I have a question for, and I think we have enough time, and I would really like each one of you to answer this question, okay? I'd like to just start with Kyo, and then Mal, and then Terri, okay? But my question is, you all have a gift. My limited interpretation, your gift is being able to go through your world and attach meaning to what it is that you see, either by way of the written word or a combination of the written word and some medium. And my question is, for a layperson like myself, what does that feel like? As you move through the world, what does it feel like for you to be able to put this down and express it in the way that you do?
Oh, that's an amazing question. And also a very hard to answer one, because it's always kind of been this way. Heavy, I suppose. It's something, I don't want to call it a burden, because it certainly isn't, but it's something that, looking around and sharing an experience, feels like a necessity. Not even necessarily to write it or to get it out, but to share it in some way, to say, look at this and make the connections. And I suppose it's really just, it feels very connected. Looking at maybe a plant and thinking of a person, looking at a river and thinking of a community. It's a very nice way to kind of always feel like part of a community.
I'd say it feels good to be able to self-criticize, and it also feels conflicting in the context of other people as well as yourself, because you find out, or you think of, or not to say like you're psychic or anything because of these tendencies, but you find out things about people that maybe they're hiding, or you find out things about yourself that you were hiding subconsciously. And that's just my experience thus far.
For me, it's partly a matter of my limitations. I mean, there's so many things that I don't say this as poor mouthing. I mean, I'm glad I don't know how to do everything. I'm glad I don't know how to fix anything. You know, I'm glad I have a bad sense of direction, because they've contributed to make to the things that I can do, or to really look hard and try not to shut my eyes, you know, try not to shut my ears. And one of the things about being a writer and an artist is that you're always an observer, and you're always an observer in a historical line with people that have gone before you and with people that have gone after you. And there's a great lonely comfort in that, to sit in front of a, you know, 600-year-old painting and to recognize the hat, which my collaborator Kyo-Nicole Lopez, who's here tonight and has had the pleasure of teaching these two wonderful artists and writers with us, is here. And last night we were talking about this, you know, hat we saw on this, you know, in this museum that, you know, hundreds of years old.